The death of inmate Edwards. Inmate Edwards was a double murderer and a devil worshiper, and he had 666 tattooed across his back. Hi, I'm Gary York, True Prison Stories. If you like this story, please subscribe to my channel. Inmate John Edwards was at Zephyrhills Correctional Institution, Florida, and he got into a confrontation with a couple of officers. He jumped one of the officers and bit a large chunk of meat out of the officer's face. He then spit the meat onto the floor, or the facial flesh onto the floor, and he looked at the officer and said, "I have AIDS, now you have AIDS too, you motherfucker." The officers took inmate Edwards down at that point and restrained him, and medical emergency was called for the officer who had the flesh torn from his face. Transport orders were immediately put into place for inmate Edwards to be sent from Zephyrhills Correctional Institution near Tampa, Florida, to Charlotte Correctional Institution near Fort Myers, Florida. As inmate Edwards was being prepared for transport, a captain from Zephyrhills Correctional Institution called the captain at Charlotte Correctional Institution and told him what had happened and said, "Inmate Edwards is headed your way. Can you do us a favor and take care of him?" Captain at Charlotte Correctional Institution said, "No problem. We've got it. Send him on." Two officers from Zephyrhills transported inmate Edwards to Charlotte Correctional Institution. They got him into the Sallyport area. He was cuffed and leg shackled, of course. After his behavior, he was now considered a very violent and dangerous inmate. Several officers, including a captain and two sergeants, had met inmate Edwards at the Sallyport gate, awaiting his arrival. And when he was taken off the van in the Sallyport, he was thrown to the floor face first, thrown to the ground face first, and then he was picked up, and on the way to medical, before being checked into Charlotte Correctional Institution, he had hit the ground several more times. And then he was checked in at medical with no injuries noted, and he was sent to a special dorm to be monitored. Use of force reports were initiated by this shift, indicating that he had been combative, spitting, and trying to kick on the way from the Sallyport gate to the medical unit. Now, we have no reason to believe that this did not occur. Inmate Edwards was then, for the next 5 days, beaten and tortured by two shifts, the 3 to midnight shift and the midnight to 8 a.m. shift, each run by a captain who had a history of abusing inmates, and each captain had certain staff members who were nicknamed the family. If you were part of this group that these two captains had, you were called part of the family. If you did not partake or participate in their abusive games, then you were an outcast. And many officers there feared this group called the family, which is not a good thing to have in a correctional setting, a separation of officers. A group of vigilantes and a group of officers trying to do the right thing, but too scared to report them. Over the next 5 days, inmate Edwards would receive his food through the food flap, and it would be knocked on the floor, and they would tell inmate Edwards, "Now eat your food off the floor." And he would be beaten throughout the next 5 days at different times by both shifts, neither shift knowing how much the other shift had beaten inmate Edwards. Now, the one thing that inmate Edwards had that he probably should not have had is his ID tag, which has a little metal clasp. And by the 4th day, inmate Edwards had had enough of the abuse, and he took his metal clasp and cut his wrists. So the officers found him laying in a pool of blood in his cell. He was taken out of his cell, and there were drag marks where he was dragged out of his cell down the hallway, where you could see the blood from the pool of blood all the way out down the hallway where he'd been dragged. He was taken to medical, and the captain told the nurse had said, "We have to call the doctor. He has to have stitches for this. This has to be, or he may have to go to outside hospital." The captain said, "You're not calling any doctor. Fix it up as best you can." And the nurse did what the captain said and did butterfly stitches and did the best she could. And the inmate was moved to CSU C dorm, if I recall correctly, and placed in the C dorm. And in that dorm, he was placed, stripped down naked and placed on a metal bunk, no mattress, a metal bunk with 4-point restraints. And the captain got on top of the inmate and stood on his chest and then pulled chest hairs from his chest, and he says, "Damn, that's gotta hurt. Damn, that's gotta hurt." And the inmate was asking for water. The inmate orderly said, "Can I give him some water, boss?" Captain said, "Hell no, he don't deserve water, he doesn't deserve food, he doesn't deserve anything." And he was beaten some more at this point while on 4-point restraints. On day 5, we get a call at our Inspector General's office. We're in a meeting at about 8 in the morning, and we're told there's an inmate deceased in CSU, and he is in 4-point restraints naked, and he's dead. My supervisor looks at me and says, "Hit the road." I still have to drive about another hour and a half to get to Charlotte Correctional Institution, maybe an hour and 45 minutes. We do have an inspector out that way, and Inspector Don Charwood gets there and takes care of the crime scene issues and begins photographing and such. When I get to the prison inspector and meet Inspector Charwood, he says, "We've got a serious one here." And I looked, and it does not take an Einstein to realize that this inmate did not beat himself. He didn't put himself in 4-point restraints. So no matter which verdict you wish to render in this case, okay, it does not take an Einstein to realize the inmate could not do this to himself. So we sweep the crime scene, we take photographs, we get everybody's names that are in cells next to the inmate cell, we get all the nurses' names that were on duty that night, we get all the shift roster so we know all the officers that were on duty that night. We have a medical examiner come out. They pronounce inmate Edwards dead, and he's transported for an autopsy. And by the way, he has bruises from head to toe, black and blue bruises. He has blood on his body. He has some uneaten breakfast that they tried to give him at about 4:30 a.m. when we were told he was still alive. And of course, we took all that breakfast meal and the milk that was next to him and bagged it and tagged it as evidence and sent it into toxicology to make sure that he wasn't poisoned. There were other obvious signs of other things that went on as well, as I told you. And now we have a very serious incident. For the first 3 days, I investigate this crime. Now, we've learned that inmate Edwards, as I told you earlier, was a devil worshiper. He has 666 tattooed across his back. He thought his girlfriend was cheating on him in Tampa, Florida, and he found his girlfriend with her dad, with her father. He shot both of them, killed both of them, without even wanting an explanation or trying to get an explanation, in a jealousy rage. We understand that he might have had some mental issues, or he did have some mental issues. And all these things compiled, we have a very dangerous inmate. Now, we begin the investigation, or I begin the investigation the first 3 days by myself. And I interview officers on both shifts, sergeants on both shifts. I don't interview the captains yet. I leave them alone for now. And all the officers told the same exact story. Everything was in order. Nobody had beaten anybody. Nobody had done anything wrong. Use of force reports reflected that the inmate was combative and he was taken down to the ground, etc., etc. So by day 4, the news media has gotten a hold of this death because we have an autopsy and everything else. And now the autopsy did reveal that he died from too much loss of blood. So you have a suicide now, according to the autopsy. But the autopsy also revealed numerous bruises, outer bruises and inner body bruises throughout the body from head to toe. So there's another issue we had to look at. The news media kicks in, and now the news articles start to come out. Inmate death, is it a murder or is it suicide? And these things are hitting all the papers. On day 4, I get a phone call from one of the officers. He says, please, I got to talk to you. I can't sleep at night. I can't take it anymore. Well, one of the 10 officers involved, we have 2 captains, 2 sergeants, and 6 officers. He meets with me. He gives me a second interview on a sworn taped interview. And he tells it all. He explains how they plan to meet inmate Edwards and take care of him from the beginning. He explains all these things I told you, because you probably had wondered during the story, well, how do you know this happened? How do you know they threw the food trays on the floor? How do you know they beat him every day? How do you know they slapped him? How do you know that the captain pulled chest hairs and stood on his chest while he was in full-point restraints? Well, we have one officer coming forward now and telling the entire story of what happened, because he can't deal with it anymore. His conscience has got to him. Then we have another officer, second one, come forward, and he is a sergeant. So now we have an officer and a sergeant that tells exactly everything that happened, all the wrongdoings that took place. Now the FBI come in, FDLE comes in, because now things are popping. So we go to Fort Myers, Florida, and there's me from the Inspector General's office, the assigned investigator. There's an FBI agent now who's going to be assigned with me. There's an FDLE agent, Florida Department of Law Enforcement agent, who's going to be assigned with me. And we're talking with the federal prosecutor, Douglas Malloy. They asked me to step out of the office, and I do. They talked for a few minutes. They asked me to come back in. And they said, we've looked at everything you've done so far, and we want to keep you as the lead investigator on the case. You've already done the first 4 or 5 days alone, but now we're going to put these gentlemen with you to work with you, which was fine with me, because a complex investigation like this, and I was already getting threats. I was getting threats from the officers involved, mainly the 2 captains and their little cronies. A warden had called me and said, Gary, when you come to Charlotte County to investigate this case, don't stay in any hotels in this area. Stay outside the county, because we're getting word through the grapevine that they said if they catch you alone, they're going to beat your ass. Well, I didn't do any of this. I'm just the assigned investigator. I didn't do anything at Zephyr Hills. I didn't do anything over that 5-day period. I'm investigating a crime. But when rats get cornered, rats will attack you. And that's just the way it goes. I'm sorry if that offends anybody, but that's what happens. They attack the person that's in front of them. I'm in front of them at this point, threatening their careers and possibly their freedom. So now they're after me, the rotten inspector who's going to come in and try to get us, and put us away. Well, that's not the truth. Our job is to investigate and do the best we can to be impartial and walk down the middle and let the chips fall where they may. So, as the investigation goes on, Now I'm working with the state attorney's office as well. Robert Howell, state attorney investigator, and I are working together. And Rob Howell gets a phone call from a third officer. He wants to testify. And we meet with him on an emergency meeting and tape his interview after reading him his rights, and he tells us everything that happened. 2 officers now on board, 1 sergeant, telling the truth, everything that happened. These people at least have a conscience, and they were manipulated by their captains to do these things. And they fell into the trap of manipulation, not from an inmate this time, but by their own captain supervisors. So now we have 3 witnesses. We're ready to roll. We have a case. We're ready to go to trial. A 4th officer calls. He wants to talk. I jump in the car and head down to meet with Bob Howell, the state attorney investigator, and we want to get this 4th man on board. He is intercepted by the captains, and they call an emergency meeting, and they go to one of the officers' homes. They talk him out of talking with us. They said, stick with us. We'll get attorneys and stick with us. There'll be 7 of us and 3 of them. Three officers' words against our word. So now we did not get the 4th person on board. They talked him out of it. We have 3 on board, a sergeant and 2 officers. But now we're interviewing the nursing staff. Guess what? 2 of the nurses, their conscience, they didn't want to do this, but they were threatened by the captains and by the sergeants. They should have reported it immediately. We all know that. They should have immediately went. They would have been protected. We wouldn't let these sergeants or captains harm them or threaten them anymore. But they went along and followed the orders of the captains to report specific things only in their medical reports. They falsified medical reports now. They knew of a crime and didn't report it, but both nurses came on board and told the truth of what happened and what they were told. And they also said that one of the captains came to them one evening after being with inmate Edwards and asked for medical attention. His hand was bruised and hurt, and they had to tape his hand up. We even had that. So now we have 2 officers, a sergeant, and 2 nurses, 5 eyewitnesses. This thing goes on for weeks and weeks in the newspaper. A total of 22 staff members at Charlotte Correctional Institution terminated. We end up having administrative hearings on all the officers. All the administrative hearings substantiated that these officers had misconduct. They were terminated, and their certifications were sent to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, to the Professional Compliance Office, and they did end up all losing their certifications. We lost several nurses, falsifying documents and things. They all lost their job. And we lost some officers, some good officers who were too scared to report what happened. They did not participate in the incident, but they saw it happen. But the threat of this group called the Family, led by 2 thug captains, cost them their jobs for failure to report. 22 staff members gone. We haven't gone to criminal court yet. A year later, we're finally in criminal court in Fort Myers, Florida. We have a 2-week trial, and after 2 weeks, the jury goes out to deliberate. They've heard testimony from 2 officers, a sergeant, and 2 nurses, eyewitness testimony. They've heard my testimony on what I found. They've heard from other experts, etc., etc. They've heard from the medical examiner. Each officer sitting there, the 7 officers who stuck together, are waiting for the verdict. The day comes, we go out, the verdict's in, not guilty on all counts. The officers were acquitted. So now you have 5 people going to federal probation because they pled for probation for 5 years in exchange for not going to prison and giving their testimony. So the 5 people who came forward and told the truth are on 5 years federal probation. These 7 officers are acquitted. And man, did that courtroom roar. They just went crazy. And later, the newspapers wrote a story and actually had photographs. 3 or 4 of the women in the jury panel went and partied that night or that afternoon with the officers and had drinks with the officers that were acquitted. So, you know, I don't know what to tell you. Now, we do know that when the jury's panel was interviewed, they said they could not find officers guilty over an inmate with 666, devil worshiper, double murderer, and attacks officers, and bit an officer who was married, newly married, and bit a chunk of meat out of his face. He had to undergo testing for a 2-year period to make sure he did not have AIDS. You know that had to affect his new marriage. You know it had some effect, wondering every day if he'd gotten AIDS. There's a lot of things with this story. Whatever your verdict is your verdict. Whatever you think is right is right. But in the end, they're not officers anymore. Some of them are not nurses anymore. But the thing is, folks, we can't take the law into our own hands. Yes, they were acquitted, but look what it put us through. Look at what it did to the agency. Look at the black eye it put on corrections. I had officers tell me from Charlotte Correctional Institution that they were pulling into the gas station on the way to work or on the way home in uniform. And citizens were looking and mumbling, there's one of those abusers, there's one of those inmate beaters. Well, you know, we can't stop what people think, but we can sure try to do the right thing at work. We can't be vigilantes. We cannot go on these raids and take the law into our own hands. We should have just housed the inmate and sent him back to trial for biting the officer in the face. And 22 people would still have their jobs. 5 people would not be on federal probation. And that's the story of inmate John Edwards, devil worshiper, and the vigilante group that took law into their own hands. And if those 7 officers that were acquitted want to call that a win for them, let them call it a win. But they're not in our business any longer. Thank you. True Prison Stories, Gary York. Please subscribe if you like this video.